Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 512. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anslone. We got a lot of news on today's show, but first, want to remind everyone that we are holding our end of the year fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We only do a couple fundraisers a year at the Institute, and we do raise just what we need to keep the doors open, to keep paying staff for all the content that you get. At the Institute, we are absolutely fearless on the foreign policy issues. And so whether it's the war in Ukraine, U.S. support for Israel, and its destruction of Gaza, the Institute is not going to sell out or censor its message in any ways. We will continue to be bold on these issues and speak out. So please support the Libertarian Institute. Right now we have matching funds, $10,000. So if you make a donation, that donation will be doubled. It's a great way to help out the Institute. We have some great kitbats that we offer. And, you go directly to supporting this show, all the articles that I write for the Institute, the daily news roundup that I put out, and a lot of other great content like the Scott Horton Show, Tom Woods' latest book, James Bovard and Keith Knight both have recent books. And then, of course, co-host of the show, Connor Freeman, also does his own writing. So we have tons of great stuff at the Institute. So please head over and help us out, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And with that, let's get into today's show. The first story up here is about alleged Discord leaker. The commanding officer of Massachusetts National Air Guardsman Jack Teixeira has been released of his post. Teixeira is alleged to be responsible for leaking documents of dozens of top secret Pentagon documents that proved to be embarrassing for the White House. And so this is Colonel Sean Riley, and he was the commander of the 102nd Intelligence Wing at Odysee Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts. And he was removed from his position after the Pentagon conducted an investigation into the Discord leaks. The report found that Riley should have raised the alarm after he was informed Teixeira was seeking information that was outside of his scope of his position. Airmen working on night duty, like Teixeira, had ample opportunity to access classified sites and print high volume of products without supervision or detection, the report said. The preponderance of the evidence shows 3 individuals at A1C Teixeira's supervisory chain of command had information about as many as 4 separate instances of security incidents and potential insider threat indicators that they were required to report. Had any of these 3 members come forward and properly disclosed the information they held at the time of the incidents, the length and depth of the unauthorized disclosures may have been reduced by several months. And Riley is among 15 soldiers who received some form of discipline over the Teixeira leads, and these range from, Riley obviously being relieved of his command, to people just receiving, I think, like notes in their file and things like that. Probably they should have reported something but didn't. And it's important to remember here too that Teixeira pled not guilty to leaking these documents. I don't know if he did it or not. If he did, good for him, because they revealed some pretty important information. So this is a little bit more from the report. Teixeira's job required system access to perform maintenance, but does not require access to intelligence content or products to maintain the system. Evidence indicates a lack of understanding of the need to know concept due to the inconsistent guidance on the topic. And so, what it's saying is that they should have been able to tell that Teixeira was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing because he was accessing information that he didn't need to know. And my guess is either he told his commanding officers, or his commanding officers told the report, whoever was interviewing them, that they didn't realize that he wouldn't need access to that information. So, very interesting there. And my guess is this is pretty pervasive throughout the Department of Defense, that there's not like a real clear understanding among commanders all the time of all the technology aspects, and say, what somebody would need to know for maintenance versus what they would need to know if they were an intelligence officer. So in April, top secret documents painting the Western proxy war against Russia in a negative light began surfacing online. Prosecutors seeking to convict Teixeira under the Espionage Act said the Air Guardsmen began posting the documents in a private Discord server named Thug Shaker Central in December of 2022. However, the Pentagon report says Teixeira could have started posting the documents as early as January of 2022, which it would actually be before the actual Russian invasion of Ukraine. One of the documents released by Teixeira was an intelligence assessment that predicted Ukraine would fall well short of its goals in the counteroffensive. American officials attempted to downplay those findings in May before Kiev launched the counteroffensive the following month. As the assessment predicted, Ukraine failed to come anywhere near achieving its goals in the counteroffensive. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers died in the offensive maneuvers. Kiev also lost a huge percentage of its military equipment by following the advice of Western officials to commit significant forces in an offensive against entrenched Russian defensive lines and massive minefields. And so, there's always this narrative, of course, that Teixeira was doing something that was negative for Ukraine or for Americans, that he was, somehow a traitor to his country, endangered national security. But when you look at this in reality, and this is true for essentially, which is really funny, anybody who's been deemed pro-Putin by the mainstream media or something like that, had any of those people been in a position to negotiate with Putin before the war in Ukraine broke out, Ukraine would have kept far more of its territory and would have lost far less soldiers, and prevented the war entirely, and would have gotten a far better deal for Ukraine than whatever Ukraine is going to have to sell for now. And so, in a way, Teixeira could have really helped the Ukrainians had the Ukrainians paid attention to these intelligence assessments. It should have been a huge red flag for Kiev going up that in private intelligence assessments, U.S. officials are saying that this isn't going to work out, and yet rather than believe these private top secret documents, the Ukrainian government believed whatever Blinken or Lloyd Austin told them about the documents and dismissed it. And so this could have really helped Ukraine had they paid attention to what these documents have said. Again, all allegedly on Teixeira's role in that. All right, so Zelensky made a visit to Washington, and this one to far less fanfare than his last. So this is pretty interesting. So this from Dave DeCamp on December 11th at antiwar.com. Ukrainian President Zelensky arrived in the U.S. on Monday and pleaded for more military aid in a speech at the National Defense University in Washington, where he was introduced by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Zelensky said, Ukrainians have given up and won't give up. We know what to do, and you can count on Ukraine. And we hope just as much to be able to count on you. Zelensky's visit comes as Washington is pressuring Congress to pass a $111 billion spending package that includes over $60 billion for Ukraine to fund the war for another year. The White House said that if Congress doesn't authorize the funds, the U.S. will run out of money for the war. And this is another quote from Zelensky. Every one of you understands for a soldier to wait for munitions, waiting for a week, months, without knowing if support will come at all. Every one of you with command experience knows what it means when instead of moving forward, you're just watching, waiting for armor or equipment while your enemy is satisfied and preparing for assaults. Despite Ukraine's failed counteroffensive, Zelensky is determined to continue the war, even as Ukraine's top general has said that Ukrainian forces have little chance of breaking through Russian defenses, and Ukraine is facing manpower shortages. Sources close to Zelensky recently told Time magazine that the Ukrainian leader is deluding himself into thinking Ukraine can win the war, and he's trying to delude Washington, of course, into thinking Ukraine could win the war as well. Zelensky will meet with President Biden. All right, so I'll get into these meetings that when Dave originally wrote that we're still upcoming. All right, so this is Zelensky's meeting with the Republicans. Republicans tell Zelensky no Ukraine aid until border deal. This again from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Ukrainian President Zelensky was told by Republicans in Washington on Tuesday that Congress won't be authorizing new aid for Ukraine until a deal with Democrats on border issue can be reached. House Speaker Mike Johnson met with Zelensky and told him that Republicans support Ukraine, but won't send more aid until a transformative change in U.S. border policy and laws. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said it would be impossible to pass a massive $100 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan before Congress's Christmas break. He said, "It's practically impossible, even if we reach an agreement, to craft it, get it through the Senate, get to the House before Christmas. There won't be a deal until Joe Biden and the Republicans reach an agreement." Senator Lindsey Graham explained to Zelensky that the issue had nothing to do with Ukraine. Graham said he told the Ukrainian leader, "Here's the problem. It's got nothing to do with you." And isn't this just amazing? These are the same people that told us that if we did not support Ukraine, the world was going to crumble, the entire world order was going to collapse, that we had to send the Ukrainians hundreds of billions of our dollars just to keep America's status in the world in place. And now these Republicans are saying that, and this is a problem of Biden's own making. He decided to package the border funding with the Ukraine aid in order to try to strong arm the Republicans, and it's kind of blown up in his face. But for the Republicans, especially the Lindsey Graham types, I mean, what frauds they turn out to be. And again, comparing the people who were deemed Putin's puppets and who said that they just wanted Ukrainians to suffer and wanted Russians to win and hated the US and the rest of the world. These people were saying that, hey, let's make a negotiation here because we can't give Ukraine enough support that they actually win this war. And if you're not going to do that, and you can't because it'll escalate to a nuclear war with Russia, well, then the best solution is to negotiate now. And for these people, it's becoming very clear that they only ever see the Ukrainians as pawns. Right now, the Ukrainians are pawns to use as leverage against Joe Biden to get more aid, to have him agree to border policies the Republicans want. And, before, the Ukrainians were just leveraged to weaken Russia. And so it's all very, very cynical in the eyes of our leaders in Washington. So next up here, U.S. Ukraine looking for new strategy in war with Russia. After Ukraine failed counteroffensive, U.S. and Ukrainian officials are looking for a new strategy in the war against Russia, as political leadership of both nations are determined to keep the conflict going. The New York Times reported on the discussions and said the U.S. wants more conservative strategy of Ukraine, holding the territory it currently controls and building up its forces. The U.S. strategy also involves Ukraine building up its military-industrial complex to become less reliant on Western aid. U.S. officials told the Times that Ukrainian officials have unrealistic expectations of what the U.S. can continue to provide. It says they are asking for millions of rounds of artillery, for example, from Western stockpiles that do not exist. American officials say Ukraine will have to fight on a tighter budget. The report said the Ukrainians are looking to go on the attack in some way to get the world's attention. U.S. officials are opening to supporting more long-range Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which always risks a major Russian escalation, and certainly usually results in some pretty major Russian retaliation. To form a new strategy, the U.S. has been dispatching a 3-star general to Kiev to spend lengthy periods of time in the Ukrainian capital, breaking from the policy of not sending military advisors to Kiev. It's Lieutenant General Antonio Aguto Jr., who oversees support of Ukraine from a base in Germany, has taken on that role for the military. The report says the goal of the U.S. strategy known as hold and build, would be to create enough of a threat to Russia that Moscow would be open to negotiations either this next year in 2024 or 2025. But from Russia's perspective, time is on their side, as clear the West war fatigue is growing. And so this is just an insane policy that the West has. And again, whatever deal they're going to give for Ukraine now is far worse than what they would have gotten before. So one last part of Zelensky's trip to the U.S. here. This is actually Zelensky's own Twitter account. I got this from. He tweeted out a video where he's walking around and meeting with some of the leaders of U.S. Arms manufacturers, and Zelensky tweeted, "I met with leaders of U.S. defense companies and expressed my gratitude to every American worker who manufactures weapons that help us safeguard our people and defend our land. I appreciate all American companies that attend last week's U.S.-Ukraine Defense Industry Conference. I also propose establishing a European defense hub in Ukraine where we are prepared to make all essential decisions, cut red tape, and allocate orders. We are ready to produce more ammunition and more military vehicles, but we require support. It is important to develop joint production of artillery, ammo, air defense systems, and artillery and missile systems. Together, we can create more jobs, generate more strength, and provide more opportunities to both of our nations." And so, I think this plan is going to run into quite a few hurdles. A couple huge ones would be, of course, building a large industrial anything in a war zone is going to be very complicated, but to build a large military industrial complex when the rival power has, superior Air Force missiles and things like that, I do imagine would be impossible. I mean, can you imagine, as the U.S. is bombing Iraq every day through the 1990s, that Saddam Hussein is able to somehow build up a massive military industrial complex to go to war with the Americans under the Americans' noses? Having the what you would need to build these large complexes just won't exist in Ukraine, because Russia will, wipe it out, because, they're not going to let that be used against them. So next up here, article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, actually a pair of them here, on the Western economic war against Russia. So first up here, Russian oil revenue higher in October than any month in 2021. A Bloomberg analysis of Russian energy exports found Moscow has largely successfully circumvented the Group of Seven's price cap on Russian oil exports. The Kremlin has found buyers in India and China to replace exports to Europe. Additionally, Moscow has contracted with a group of tankers willing to transport Russian oil despite potential economic penalties. Bloomberg reports Russian net oil revenues of $11.3 billion in October, dollars, that is, in October, accounted for 31% of the nation's overall net budget revenue for the month, according to Bloomberg calculations that are built around Russian Finance Ministry data, but smooth out profit-based tax revenue. And then the Bloomberg article continues, that was the highest since May of 2022 and exceeds any single month in the year before the invasion of Ukraine, which initially caused huge volatility to the nation's export. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, President Joe Biden announced the U.S. and its allies would use sanctions to cripple the Russian economy and disable Moscow's war machine. The Kremlin was able to find partners willing to ignore Western sanctions, just such as China, India, and Turkey. As the economic war failed to deliver a blow to the Russian economy during the first year of the war, in December of 2022, Washington and its allies in the G7 imposed a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil exports. However, Moscow has effectively evaded economic penalties by shipping its oil via a fleet of tankers that operate outside of Western enforcement mechanisms. The White House has indicated that its next step will be sanctioning the individual tankers carrying Russian oil exports. It's unclear if this policy will have more of an impact than previous measures the Biden administration has taken. And I want to, address one more thing here. In most of the mainstream articles on this, they call it the Russian shadow fleet that is carrying the Russian oil, right? And they make it sound very dark and mysterious. And in this Bloomberg article, they say that, the Russians were transferring oil from one ship to another right in front of them. And so I think to call it a shadow fleet is kind of a way to try to demonize it, when really it's just a group of oil tankers that aren't going to bend to the American whims, and owners of those oil tankers, companies, and things like that. So next up here, U.S. issues hundreds of new sanctions targeting Russia. This was just yesterday, December 12th. I wrote this for antiwar.com. And Libertarian Institute, sorry. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that the U.S. has put 250 individuals and entity on blacklist for supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Washington has waged an economic war aimed at destroying the Russian economy for the past 20 months. However, Russia has largely successfully circumvented the Western financial penalties. Blinken said in a statement the U.S. is imposing sanctions on over 250 individuals and entities in connection with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Department of State is imposing sanctions on 100 entities and individuals, including those engaged in sanctions invasion, furthering Russia's ability to wage its war against Ukraine, and bolstering Russia's energy production and export capacity. This statement continues. Concurrently, the Department of Treasury is imposing sanctions on 150 individual entities, including multiple networks used by Russia to circumvent sanctions, numerous third country suppliers to Russia military industrial base, and additional financial institutions. And then another portion of those sanctions were directed at North Korea. The State Department said, as part of this action, we are designating entities involved in the proliferation of military equipment and munitions from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's DPRK, or the official name of North Korea, to Russia. As a consequence of Washington's effort to isolate Moscow has resulted in Russia forming stronger ties with countries such as North Korea, Iran, China, and India. Russian President Putin has met with the North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, and the two countries pledged to increase economic, space, and military ties during that meeting, and have even floated the idea of trilateral military drills between China, Russia, and North Korea. All right, next up here. Nearly half of U.S. voters think Biden is spending too much on Ukraine. This is some good news, as the Biden administration is seeking over $60 billion to fund the war in Ukraine for another year. A poll found that nearly half of American voters think the U.S. is spending too much on conflict. The poll, conducted by the Financial Times, found that 48% of respondents said the U.S. was spending too much on military and financial aid to Ukraine, while 27% said the U.S. was spending the right amount. Just 11% believe the U.S. should be spending more. Republicans are more opposed to U.S. spending on the war, as 65% said the U.S. was spending too much compared to 52% of independents and only 32% Democrats. The results do not bode well for Ukrainian President Zelensky, who arrived in Washington on Monday to plead for more military aid. His visit comes as it has become clear that Ukraine has no chance of beating Russia on the battlefield, which has been acknowledged by the Ukraine's top general. The poll also posed the same question about U.S. spending military aid on Israel since October 7th. The poll found 40% of respondents believed the U.S. was spending too much, while 30% said the U.S. was sending the right amount. So, this is interesting. It does appear that Americans are maybe a little less hawkish than they once were, which, is definitely good from my viewpoint. All right, next up here. Ukrainian foreign minister offers to jump and dance for EU membership. Now, this is, a little bit funny, right? In the Ukrainian foreign minister isn't being serious. He's not actually offering to start hopping up and down for some of the other EU foreign ministers or something like that. But I do think it's like just another little insight into how desperate Kiev is. So Kuleba first said that he is struggling to understand. So Hungary is currently holding up, is the main blocker to Ukraine starting to move through the European Union membership process. Although, even if Hungary wasn't holding up the process, I still think that Kiev and say Berlin have very different views on how long it would take for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. But Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, really expressed his frustration with Hungary, saying that his country is struggling to understand the harsh statements from Hungary. And Hungary objects to the Ukrainian ethnic laws that discriminate against the over 100,000 Hungarians who live in Ukraine. And then in, kind of the desperate statement here, Kuleba said, "We can jump and dance if that is a request in addition to what has been done, but I think that the game should be played fairly. Ukraine did within months what was expected to be done." And the Hungarian foreign minister refused to bow to what he described as tremendous pressure from his European Union partners on the Ukraine issue. He said that the Commission's assessment that Ukraine was meeting its obligations is simply not true. All right, now let's move on to some war news about Gaza. It's all war. It's all very bad in Gaza. Biden administration bypasses Congress to get more tank shells to Israel. The Biden administration is bypassing Congress to get 13,000 rounds of tank ammunition to Israel to fuel its onslaught in Gaza by waiving congressional review period for foreign weapon sales. On Friday night, the State Department notified Congress that it was going through with the $106 million sale of 120 millimeter tank ammunition to Israel. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.3 billion a year in foreign military financing, but it is unclear if those funds are being used for that. Israel does buy U.S. weapons as well. A State Department official told the New York Times that the administration invoked an emergency provision in the Arms Export Control Act to push through the sale without congressional oversight. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said he personally approved the sale and defended the move on Sunday. Israel needs it in combat right now with Hamas, and we want to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against Hamas. That's what Blinken said. According to the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the tank shells will come from the U.S. Army inventory. So I guess maybe they found some Presidential Drawdown Authority funds to send it. That could be a possibility too. Senator Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland, criticized the administration's decision to bypass Congress. He said the administration's decision to short circuit is already quit time frame for congressional review, undermines transparency, and weakens accountability. The public deserves better. U.S. military aid to Ukraine has come under increasing criticism due to the massive civilian casualty rate in Israel's assault on Gaza. The news of the administration bypassing Congress to get more arms into Israel's hands came after the U.S. vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And we'll have more on that later. Josh Paul, a former State Department official who resigned over President Biden's full-throated support of Israel, told The Times, the combination of the United States veto of a ceasefire resolution in the UN and the expedited position of lethal arms to Israel should cause serious consideration of whether the Secretary's repeated assertions that the U.S. needs to minimize civilian casualties in Israel's operation in Gaza are sincere. All right, next up here is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Aid groups. Significant change from U.S. needed to pull Gaza back from abyss. So the New York Times published an op-ed by the heads of 6 top international humanitarian organizations, issuing a dire warning about Gaza and demanded that President Joe Biden alter his unfettered support for Israel to help stop the horrific crisis from unfolding. A senior UN official recently alerted that half of the people in Gaza are starving. So these are a couple quotes from the New York Times op-ed. As the leaders of some of the world's largest global humanitarian organizations, we have seen nothing like the siege of Gaza. About 18,000 Gazans, including more than 75,000 children, have been killed. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, more children have been reported killed in this conflict than all major global conflicts combined last year. The article, written by Michelle Nunn of Care USA, Taja McKenna of Mercy Corps, Jan England of Norwegian Refugee Council, Abby Matzman of Oxfam America, Jeremy Kondyke of Refugee International, and Janti Sartor of Save the Children US. So those are the 6 organizations, and the heads of their group wrote this letter, and they say that a lack of basic goods has increased suffering on an enormous scale. They write, most of our organization has been operating in Gaza for decades, but we can do nothing remotely adequate to address the level of suffering there without an immediate and complete ceasefire and an end to the siege. The aerial bombardment has rendered our jobs impossible. Withholding water, fuel, food, and other basic goods has created an enormous scale of need that aid alone cannot offset. On Sunday, the World Food Program reported that 6% of households in Gaza are experiencing severe hunger, with moderate hunger occurring in 52%. Palestinians in 91% of households go to bed hungry, and 63% of respondents reported enduring entire days without food. Carl Sku, Deputy Security Director for WFP, posted on X that half of people in Gaza are now starving. He said there's not enough food, people are starving. WFP has reached over 1 million people, but the situation is untenable. We need to get our supplies in, and we need to get a humanitarian ceasefire. He went on to say, and by the way, he's recently been in Gaza, that he estimates that 9 out of 10 Gazan residents are not eating every day. In addition to food shortages and a lack of cooking fuel or wood to burn is adding to the hunger. The widespread destruction of Gaza by a historic bombing campaign waged by Israel has caused massive displacement. The UN believes 1.9 million of the 2.3 million people living in Gaza have been internally displaced. Some Gazans report having died, seen others die of hunger and exposure. One Palestinian told Reuters that he had not eaten in 3 days. The leaders of the humanitarian groups said in their op-ed that the U.S. must act now to stop the onslaught. Global leaders, and especially the United States government, must understand that we cannot save lives under these conditions. A significant change in approach from the U.S. government is needed today to pull Gaza back from this abyss. On top of starvation, illness is being spread as a result of the Israeli military operations. World Health Organization Director General said there are signals of epidemic disease, including bloody diarrhea and jaundice. He added that the Gaza healthcare system is on its knees and collapsing. World Food Program staff member in Gaza said the outlook for residents of Gaza is dismal. If death doesn't come from airstrikes, it will come from starvation, he said. And so just, some of the very horrific things going on in Gaza. This from Haaretz. Data shows Israeli bombing of Gaza less restrained than in past operations. So Haaretz reports, in Pillar of Defense, Guardian of the Wall, and Breaking Dawn, which are some recent military Israeli operations in Gaza, the rate of non-combatants stood at about 40% of total enemy fatalities. In the Shield and Arrow operation this past May, a slight shift occurred and the number of civilians fell to about a third of all fatalities. This, notwithstanding that in the opening attack, which was aimed at apartments that housed Islamic Jihad activists, where 10 civilians were killed. So they're saying that, in that May operation, they killed a lot of civilians in the very beginning, but still, by comparison to past operations, the total number of civilians killed versus Hamas members was only 33%, down from 40% of the previous operations. However, according to the data, 6,747 people were killed during the October 7th to 26th period in Gaza. This calculation shows that of a total of those about 7,000, at least 4,594 individuals of both sexes can be categorized as non-combatants, 68% of the total. So that's almost actually double the number of the percentage of the people killed from May versus the operations in October were civilians. So the Haaretz article continues, from an international and comparative perspective too, this is a high figure considering that in new wars fought during the 20th century, World War II up until the 1990s, about half of those kills were civilians, and this includes wars in which the most important component was the ground combat, not relatively precise strikes from the air. In light of such a high proportion of non-combatants among those killed in Swords of Iron, that's the name of the current operation, we may suspect that the principle of discrimination was not upheld, or perhaps the principle of proportionality was subject to a highly flexible interpretation. And this is, I think, the real devastating quote here. Thus, rather than this being a case of collateral damage, it is the reverse. Because most of those harms are civilians, what was produced is collateral benefit in the form of a low number of Gazan combatants killed. And so, they're saying that basically they're just wiping out Gaza. And if they happen to kill some members of Hamas, great. But if not, they're still achieving their goals. Because the primary goal isn't really the destruction of Hamas, it's the destruction of Gaza as a whole. All right, so next up here, this is Joseph Borrell, the European Union's top foreign policy official. And he said on Monday that the destruction in Gaza as a result of the Israeli bombing campaigns could be even greater than the damage to the German cities during World War II. Borrell called the situation in Gaza catastrophic and apocalyptic, and noted that the Israeli onslaught has resulted in an incredible number of civilian casualties. Discussing the destruction of buildings in Gaza, he said it is more or less or even greater than the destruction suffered by the German cities during the Second World War. Borrell made similar comments on Friday, saying the Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza was one of the most intense in history, and said the destruction is comparable, if not higher, to the destruction of German cities during World War II. A report from the Financial Times found the damage in northern Gaza to be comparable to the most heavily bombed German cities in World War II. And this is something that I discussed on the last show. We also have a quote from the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Israeli officials and their supporters in the U.S. have invoked the Allied strategic bombing campaigns of World War II to justify the mass slaughter of Gaza. The U.S. Israeli ambassador to the U.K. said there were many civilians that got attacked from your attacks on German cities. He said, referencing the World War II bombing campaigns, or she said, referencing the World War II bombing campaigns. Dresden was a symbol, but you attacked Hamburg, you attacked other cities, and altogether it was over 600,000 German civilians that got killed. Was it worth it in order to defeat Nazi Germany? And the answer was yes. And, that is very disturbing, because it kind of sounds like she's really looking for a way to justify killing 600,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Biden says Israel's Gaza bombing campaign is indiscriminate, but vows to keep reporting it. President Biden on Tuesday said Israel was losing its global support due to indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, which has been supported by unconditional U.S. military aid, and criticized certain elements of the government of Israel of Israeli government that's led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So Israeli secured, this is Biden's statement. Israel's security can rest on the United States, but right now it has more than the United States. It has the European Union, it has Europe, and it has most of the world supporting it, which just isn't true, but I'm not sure if Biden knows or not that that's not true. He continues, but they are starting to lose that support by the indiscriminate bombing that takes place. Despite labeling the Israeli bombing campaign as indiscriminate, he said the U.S. will continue to provide Israel military assistance, which involves sending Israel 2,000-pound bombs. He said the literal security of Israel as an independent Jewish state is literally at stake, but it is unshakable our commitment to Israel. We continue to provide military assistance to Israel as it goes after Hamas. Biden said Netanyahu is justified in his slaughter by pointing out the U.S. and allied bombing campaigns during World War II, as the destruction in Gaza is comparable to the most heavily bombed German cities. It was pointed out to me that by Benjamin Netanyahu that, well, you guys carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atomic bomb, and a lot of civilians died, Biden said. The president said he told Netanyahu that's why all these institutions were set up after World War II, to see that it didn't happen again. But he's using that to justify it at the same time, which is really wild. Don't make the same mistake we did at 9/11. There was no reason why we had to be in war in Afghanistan at 9/11. There was no reason to do some of the things that we did. Biden called Netanyahu a good friend, but said that he needs to change his government, and singled out Itamar Ben-Gvir, an extremist settler who leads the Israeli Jewish Power Party and serves as Israel's Minister of National Security. The Jewish Power Party was the only faction in Netanyahu's cabinet that voted against a hostage deal that involved a pause in the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. You know, Ben-Gvir is not what you would call someone who, he is not the most, this is the most conservative government in Israeli history, the most conservative, Biden said. He added, Ben-Gvir and company don't want anything remotely approaching a two-state solution. And so, this is really interesting that Biden is somehow able to have all these thoughts and really not piece together how they all contradict with each other. I guess it isn't surprising. He's probably just given a speech and reads it, but and kind of goes off on his own little tangents and things when he's talking about Netanyahu, but acknowledging that he wants a two-state solution and the Israeli government doesn't want a two-state solution. He doesn't want indiscriminate bombing at Gaza. Yeah, he's going to keep giving Israel weapons. It's just stupid. All right, next up here, UN official says Israel trying to push Gazans into Egypt. So this is the commissioner of the UN Agency for Palestinians, UNWRA, and he said the population has been pushed more and more into tinier and tinier and tinier pieces of land in the Gaza Strip, and there is no way that this piece of land will be able to accommodate such a high number of people. The developments we are witnessing point to attempts to move Palestinians into Egypt, regardless of whether they stay there or are resettled elsewhere. The internal displacement of millions of Gazans to the southern part of their territory was the first stage in this scenario. The next stage is underway, forcing people out of urban center of Khan Yunis and closer to the Egyptian border. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said there is no effective protection of civilians in Gaza. I expect public order to completely break down soon, and an even worse situation could unfold. A Palestinian civil servant who lives with his family in South Gaza and who fled to South Gaza at Tel Aviv's direction said, "We have no other place and no safe place. We are fighting day and night just to get some bread, water, and vegetables. We are punished for something we don't have any role in. The civilians who are being killed day and night all around Gaza should not have been punished." So next up here, Israel rejects international pressure for ceasefire and signals Gaza onslaught will go on for months or longer. So the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant on Monday rejected international pressure for a ceasefire in Gaza and signaled that the brutal assault will continue for months or even longer. In just over 2 months of Israel's campaign in Gaza, at least 18,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 7,000 children, and 49,000 have been injured. The casualty number provided by the Gaza Health Ministry are believed to be lower than the true death toll, as they do not account for bodies buried under the rubble. On top of the mass death toll from Israeli airstrikes and ground operations, health services in Gaza had collapsed and Palestinians are facing severe food shortages. The international charity Doctors Without Borders has said that its employees in southern Gaza have never seen the complete collapse of a healthcare system in the area, along with the rest of the healthcare system in Gaza. The horrific scene coming out of Gaza has prompted more calls for peace and negotiations, but the U.S. is not phased and continues to provide unconditional military support for Israel, and even vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. Speaking to the Associated Press, Gallant said Israel's war in Gaza would take time and suggested that the current phase of the war, which involves constant airstrikes and heavy ground fighting, will last for weeks, and that further military action against pockets of resistance would continue for months. Israel's national security advisor made similar comments over the weekend, saying that the time it will take to achieve Israel's goals in Gaza cannot be measured in weeks, and I'm not sure it can be measured in months. The Financial Times recently reported that Israel expects its operations in Gaza to last over a year. All right, so next up, we had this from Dave DeCamp. We've referenced this a few times. Netanyahu said he appreciates U.S. veto of UN Gaza ceasefire resolution. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said Saturday that he appreciated the U.S. vetoing a UN Security Council resolution that called for the immediate ceasefire in Gaza and vowed to continue his the war in the besieged enclave, which has killed at least 18,000 Palestinians. Netanyahu said, other countries must also understand that it is impossible to support the elimination of Hamas on one side and on the other call for an end to the war, which will prevent the elimination of Hamas. Therefore, Israel will continue our just war to eliminate Hamas and achieve our war's other objectives that we set. And you wonder if some of those objectives include the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, or the genocide of Palestinians living in Gaza. The U.S. is facing global backlash and criticism from fellow UN Security Council members for being the only vote against the ceasefire resolution, as Israel is killing civilians at a historic pace. The Security Council held a vote on Friday after Secretary General Guterres invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, which allows him to force a discussion if he believes international peace and security is at risk. 13 members of the UN Security Council voted in favor of the resolution, while the UK abstained from voting and the US used its veto power in order to kill the measure. Robert Wood, the deputy U.S. ambassador to the UN, criticized the resolution because it didn't condemn Hamas and reiterated the U.S.'s opposition to a ceasefire. So we also had another vote at the United Nations, and this is from Ted Snyder. It's actually a Viewpoint article that we have at antiwar.com today, but it's got a lot of news in there too. Want to really highlight this because Ted is a fantastic writer and has done a lot of really, really good work on the war in Ukraine. And this is one of his, first articles that he's written on the situation in Israel that's really focused on it, and this is good. So the United Nations Secretary General Guterres had invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter for the first time in his tenure as Secretary General. Article 99 states that the Secretary General may bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter which his opposition may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. It was the first time it had been invoked since 1989. The 15-member Security Council responded by holding a meeting to vote on the immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, as the members of the European Union, of the UN Security Council, and like-minded partners to support the resolution. 13 nations voted in favor of the resolution, with the UK abstaining and the US using its veto. 1 month earlier, the United Nations General Assembly gathered for the 31st time to vote on ending the U.S. embargo of Cuba. For the 31st time, the resolution was overwhelmingly passed. 187 countries voted in favor of the resolution. Ukraine abstained. Only Israel voted with the U.S. against the resolution to end the embargo. So as the U.S. is isolated, we now have another vote in Gaza, this one about Gaza in the UN General Assembly. This one on December 12th, the General Assembly held a vote on Resolution 377A. 153 countries voted in favor of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, 23 abstained, and only 8 joined the US and Israel with a no vote. Austria and Czechia were the only EU countries to vote no. France and Spain voted yes, while the UK and Germany abstained. Once again, the US stood nearly alone. And so what Ted's really pointing out here is a lack of US diplomacy, is what he goes on to argue in his article. But we really see this in these particular UN votes, how the US is really alone on a few issues, including and probably most importantly, support for Israel in the ceasefire there. We're even divided from our European Union allies who are demanding yes votes on these resolutions, and we're abstaining from them. All right, so this will be the last article I have for today. There's a lot of other important stuff going on in the Middle East and Lebanon and Yemen, and I'll get to that on Friday's show. But here, 5,000 Israeli soldiers injured fighting in Gaza. An Israeli newspaper reports that 5,000 Israeli soldiers have been wounded during the Swords of Iron operation. 56% of the injuries have been recorded as severe. 2,000 soldiers have been disabled by the injuries. Deputy Director and head of the Ministry of Defense's Rehabilitation Department said, "We have never faced something like this. Who will help them shower or get them around the house? Most of the victims have suffered serious injuries, and the state needs to understand that there is an arena here that requires a new distribution of injuries." The head of the Army's Disabled People Organization said, "There is a huge mass of wounded here even before the wave of post-trauma that will wash over us in about a year." And so they're saying that, we're only seeing the physical injuries now. We're also going to have to deal with mental health injuries in the future. And that the Army Disabled Persons Organization continued, "Israel has not experienced this level of trauma since our War of Independence. First responders and soldiers have been exposed to horrific sights since the beginning of the war. Disabled veterans of previous wars say this is the first time they know of someone who has experienced something more challenging. In the end, it is not just a war on the battlefield, but soldiers who fought inside Israel on the lawn of the kibbutz in their home." Israel reports that 420 soldiers have been killed since October 7th. I think that number does include the 200 to 300 that were actually killed by the Hamas attack on October 7th. And so I think the number is between 1 and 200 of the number of Israeli soldiers who have actually been killed fighting inside of Gaza. But I am not 100% clear on that, those numbers, to my knowledge, haven't been fully disclosed like that. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more later in the week.